So dark down here, eh? Lucky for you, I always keep a fireproof table whenever a dragon comes by for our nightly game of poker. And you just had to go and let him run that bad bluff and throw that much into the ante when you're holding four of a kind? You should have folded. You let the dragon win. For crying out loud, he burned off most of my beard. All right. It sounds like he's coming back. I think he's drank the rest of the beer. Yeah, he's destroyed my icebox. All right. Prepare yourself. Close your eyes. And I will transport us to the Lair of OmnusI. Greetings once again, heroes. It is I, OmnusI, Master of the Lair, welcoming you once more. As you can see, I've changed a little, dropped a few pounds, hard to believe through the holiday season, and decided the beard needed a little bit of a trim. But I'm still here to offer you the same expert advice on how to progress into the training for a new Game Master. We're still here on my training level, and this is level 12, where we're progressing on to a little bit more challenging task. Now we're actually going to grip the bull by the proverbial horns, and we are going to get our feet wet, preparing and running that first adventure. Now, as far as designing your own work, that's a little bit more advanced. Honestly, many Game Masters start out with a prepared module, and running something like that may be a little intimidating for a first-time Game Master, even though if you're running for a beginning group and you're starting at the starting level for a game, many games have introductory modules that are both kind on the Game Master, who doesn't have a lot of prior experience, as well as the players, with the challenges being easy enough for starting characters to weather and survive, and yet learn their craft as they go. So, that being said, we're going to assume here at level 12 that you may be interested in some sort of a prepared module or adventure. So that's what we'll be covering, and I will be showing you how to prepare and run. So, level 12, your first module. So, you're preparing for your first module. The first thing that you need is the actual module, and hopefully by this time you are already prepared for this decision by session 0. So, in this case, I'm going to use two separate modules to use as an example from very different sides of the spectrum on what a Game Master might encounter and decide to use. I will not be showing much of the internals of this. These are copyrighted works, and I don't want to step on anybody's intellectual toes. However, the processes are similar enough that I will be able to use blanket statements to hopefully give you an idea of what to expect. The first one that I'm going to introduce to you is a introductory module that was first made available as part of Free RPG Day some years ago. This one introduced an aspect of the Warhammer 40k universe called Rogue Trader, and the adventure was called Forsaken Bounty. An interesting little adventure for certain. Rogue Trader is the aspect of being on the fringes of Imperial society. You're still playing humans, but you're not in the crushing rank and file of the Imperial Guard. You are not a hypno-indoctrinated space marine. You are not playing for the other side with chaos, and you're not an Inquisitor's pawn. Or well, at least at this stage, you're probably not. Rogue traders are the branch of the Imperium that moves supplies all over the Imperium and has a certain iota of freedom, which means that you can meet up with anybody and deal with almost any kind of scenario that you can come up with, almost on a Star Wars level of dealing with alien races and having an entire universe to explore, with the omnipresent conflicts that are always in the background. So, kind of like a Tramp Freighter style game. As an introductory adventure, it has a brief thumbnail sketch of the rules that you can use, all the rules that you would need to play through that adventure, and it also comes with the added advantage of pre-generated characters. So, very handy. The only thing that you'd really need with that is dice and time to prepare. So, the second one that I'm going to introduce is on the other side. This is not made for beginners. I'm merely going over this one to kind of show you that the process is fairly similar. This one is a rather infamous adventure called The Tomb of Horrors. This is Adventure S1, written by Gary Gygax back in the day. And it stands out as being particularly, well, it doesn't hold anybody's hand. It's responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands, or maybe thousands of characters. I can tell you from personal experience, it's staying hard, and it really requires a game master who knows what they're doing. But the preparation processes are similar from somebody using one to the other. Again, I'm going to use these mostly for examples. The first step is to read the module thoroughly, cover to cover. And what you're going to expect with one of these is, in the first page, you're going to have an introductory. It's going to give the game master a thumbnail sketch so he kind of knows the story, the ebb and the flow of the adventure. In the case of these introductories, it will say, what is this grand thing of role-playing, and what does it mean to role-play in this world using these rules, this universe? Which is very useful for a new enterprise that you're opening up. If you're going into a brand new game, it's nice to have some kind of a leader that tells you where you're going, what kind of adventures that you're in for. Of course, you can take or leave most of the what's called fluff, the world around which the game is written, to corrupt it to your own ends. If you don't like the harsh, gritty reality of the Warhammer 40k universe, you could make the universe your own and change things you don't like. It's not going to be canon Warhammer 40k anymore, but it might be something that might fit your group better. But we'll get into that in a moment. The first thing to do is to read it, to understand what the game designers were trying to tell you about their game. And just by thumbing through it and reading the text and reading about the different characters in the introductory, Forsaken Bounty tells me, number one, all the characters are fighting types. There's not a lot of people who are pure thinkers. It has 1, 2, 3 sample characters. Not for a large group. You could have a larger group and just double up the number of characters, and likewise double up the number of monsters would be fine. That can lead to some interesting scenarios. It would also require a little bit more playing time. Then after that comes the summaries on the rules, so that the person running it knows how to resolve a situation, how to go through combat, which is one of the most likely scenarios that you're going to have to encounter in one of these adventures. Perhaps how to handle the talking bits, where you're not shooting at your targets. Then after that, after you've got the rules taken care of, then you look for other resources. For example, in this case, the actual text of the adventure itself. Now, if you own your module, it's yours. And one of the resources some people just don't use because Perhaps they're not used to writing in books or whatever, but there's nothing saying that you can't annotate your own books. If something strikes you as being vitally important, pull out the highlighter or underline it. Make it so that you can refer back to it. Some people like to put sticky tabs at various points in their module, especially if it's a complicated one, so that they can instantly go back to a key point, or maybe break it apart into chapters by the scenario that the players are expected to go through. Also, as you're reading through the adventure, make sure that you have an idea of the progression of the story. Some of them are going to be fairly simple, just dungeon crawl. Dungeon begins here, here are all the different rooms the players can go through, and end goal. If it's that simple, then it's relatively straightforward. The player goes into a room, you look at the area, and you know what the players are in for. If it's one that involves more story, more travel perhaps, or it's more event-oriented, that different things will happen at different times, then it's important that you have that kind of structure down quite well before you actually go into trying to run that adventure with other people. So, how are these things broken up? Well, usually an adventure, and again I'm only going to use this, it's a free module, and just to show you what it's like, a lot of times you will have a lot of expository information for the game master, and then there will usually be some sort of clearly outlined area that will give you text to relate to the players when you're actually running the game. A lot of times the language may not meet up with the way you talk, and you may want to adjust it. Quick notes on the fly can certainly help here. Writing in a separate page where you rewrite things to a point you're comfortable with may be perfectly fine. This is a point where a game master, though, should start considering developing different voices for the different tasks that he's going to have, or she. A game master, for instance, who wants to develop a narrator voice to catch the player's attention when they're actually describing things the characters see, will find their tasks to be a lot easier than if they say everything in the same voice, and the players may tune out some things even when they're very important. One way that you can get this across early on is to hold the book in front of you and make sure that everybody sees that you are reading directly out of it. That generally tends to send a lesson that you are saying something that they are going to want to know. However, you can also accomplish the same thing with voice. For instance, using your voice to switch from conversation, like, for example, well, that sword's really working out for you. So, the travel through the warp was certainly a special trip. You were only assaulted by 2 demonic raids that got through your Geller fields, and, you see, change of voice, and especially if you can make it devoid of any kind of partiality, makes for a nice neutral narrator's voice. If you also change the pitch of your tone a little bit, doesn't have to be drastic and you don't have to use a falsetto, but just enough to let the players know, especially if it's a little bit louder than you normally would talk, that you have the floor, they should be quiet, and they should be paying attention. It's very useful. And it's something that can be developed over time. If you start out and you don't have a Game Master's narrator voice yet, it's something to work to. But it is a useful tool that you should be able to draw from at some point, especially when it's important that you get their attention. And it especially works the better when you have a larger group. You're the Game Master, they've come here to listen to you and to play alongside of you, but when you need the floor, you're the one who should have the floor. And sometimes that narrator voice is the only tool you may need to get that attention. This especially becomes important when you're going through convoluted scenarios that involve only part of your groups. The talking of other people around or noise in your game space may sometimes make that communication difficult. If you can go into a narrator voice and grab your player's attention, you will find quite frequently that it attempts to drown out the clutter with the import of what you're saying. So, Sometimes that can also be arranged by different hats. And I don't always mean necessarily a physical hat, but sometimes if you want the attention and you set up as a rule in your gaming group that when I'm wearing the hat, I'm the only one talking. And be fair about it. Take off the hat if you're going to do something like that. It's just an idea. It may not work in your group, but it's something that I've seen used effectively. And it might work for you. So, knowing the things that you're going to say to your players is almost something that you might consider rehearsing so that you can narrate your story clearly and effectively. Especially if you have a bunch of words or technical terms that you should understand before you play. Making those kind of cliff notes along the way, or not cliffs notes, but making those kind of thumbnail notes in the margins can be very useful, or on a separate piece of paper that you can refer to. Now, there will also probably be leaders to other sources of information. Perhaps there will be marginal notes or footnotes. There may be entire grayscale blocks of text that outline important themes or concepts that your story needs to be made clear to be effective, to tell the story the way the designers planned it. These are good things to pay attention to. They're very seldom good things to actually narrate to your players. Most of the game mastering text is poor to use directly as narration. It's there as the behind-the-scenes instructions, kind of like the script of a play. If the audience thinks that you are reading off of the script, it's going to have drastically less impact than if you're actually playing it out. Game mastering is similar in that regard. If you are doing a good job of it, the players shouldn't always be seeing behind the curtain. They should occasionally allow themselves to be caught up in the reality that you're spinning through the story. With a module, sometimes you can fall back on reading. That's why familiarity initially is very important. So, knowing the story that you're going to tell, knowing the import behind certain things in the story can be useful. Also, understanding the characters that are going to be in the adventure itself. There will be usually blocks of text outlining statistics, how skilled a person is in combat, what their applicable skills may be, what gear they may have. Those are all useful things to know for a character. If that character is a simple obstacle in the player's way, you may not need any more information than that. If you have a fairly good grasp on the rules of the game, by reading them, you should be able to guess the thrust of what that character means as an obstacle, or possibly as an ally to the players. For example, you should be able to tell if somebody has a high amount of damage that they are a damage-dealing thug. They probably are fairly confident in their abilities because they have an ability to do great harm to others. If they're an obstacle, that possibly means that that is an important battle that the players have to consider if they're going to actually fight their way through. If it is a person who is an ally, or at the very least a neutral person, that great damage capability or combat ability may be a forewarning against the player characters thinking about engaging them in combat and making them an enemy. So, understanding that and understanding the natures of the characters is just as important as reading a script and understanding the roles of each player. So, that's possibly one of the most important things that you can do when you are previewing an adventure module, is understanding the roles of the characters and what they're doing. After that, you should try to understand the story of it, the flow of the game. Again, maybe relatively simple. There may be little thought involved in that story. If you're not running a continuing adventure, that may be fine. Your players may have no more entry point into it than you're here for golden glory, or you're here for the fabled whatsits of whatnot. That's all fine, and it's a decent enough header for a quick one-shot, or just following through in a game. It may also leave the door open for you to springboard into some other ideas of your own. Of course, these things are going to be written with a beginning, a middle, and an end quite frequently. Usually the end is some sort of climactic occurrence, And even in a dungeon, usually your entry-level monsters are going to be relatively weak to test out the group and help them to form tactics and things that'll serve them later on in the game. The middle is usually going to be the mid-range encounters. They're going to use up the party's resources and give them some differing challenges and experiences. The final challenge is often going to be something that will either sum up the lessons that they have learned, be it in one large combat where they're able to fight more effectively than they did when they first entered the combat or entered the dungeon. Or perhaps it's the scenario that everything has been building up to that will finally resolve that situation. In the part of a serial adventure, the party may get some glimpse at what awaits them in the next adventure. In this case, reading through it, they give a lot of background information on the universe around the characters and what their actions of the characters are going to mean in the context of the story. When the players succeed along a particular path, then they'll get more information and the world will open up to them a little bit more. They'll get more options for what they can do next. If they fail, there are alternate paths that allow them to pick up the story at a later time. Usually an introductory adventure is going to be very difficult to fail on. They're going to be prepared for characters who are not high level and powerful. They're going to also be prepared for players who may not know everything they can do, may not be savvy with the rules, or sometimes miss what might seem to be obvious options like flight, retreating. If the players fail in one of these adventures in, say, combat, oftentimes they wake up at some later point or are rescued by somebody else. It's not because it cheapens the conflict at all. It's because it's understood that, the players make mistakes. They may be learning this game just as well as the game master is. So, in that case, knowing those ins and outs is, again, incredibly useful for the game master. Now, with something like this, after you've read it through and you've annotated the things that you believe are important, it gives you another chance to go back and look at the characters. Before we do that, I'm also going to show you what going through the Tomb of Horrors is like. For one thing, the Tomb of Horrors was a competition-level dungeon. So, there wasn't a lot of worry about the world around. This is a relatively generic fantasy world that you find the entrance to a dungeon. You go into the dungeon. That's it. There's not a lot of extra details because the people who played this initially were people who were competing with other people to see how far along they could get into it or if they could actually defeat the dungeon itself. Looking at it, the actual dungeon itself is just these few pages. From page 1 to 10, it is a 10-page dungeon. That's it. That makes up the whole of the original Tomb of Horrors. Of course, what comes with it, and something you should understand, the inside of the cover, there is an inlay in blue scaling showing what the entrance to the dungeon looks like. And there's also a map, also in blue scaling, on the inside cover on the back. And again, the map is relatively straightforward because it wasn't a challenge in mapping out the Tomb of Horrors where the difficulty lay. Preparing for this one would work in much the same way. You would read through it. You definitely might want to annotate some things. My copy is pristine because I can't see writing in paper. I have a real problem with it, but I know it helps some people. That's why I'm offering that as advice. When I say pristine, obviously, the staples fell out. It's not in perfect shape, but it is in gameplay shape, and I'm happy with that. In addition, though, one of the most useful things that it came out with was when you have these kind of competition-level things where a lot of people's eyes are focused on not just the people playing the games, but also the adventure themselves. The earlier stuff kind of started going out of its way to really look good. What made this one special was they had a player's handout booklet with lots of wonderful pictures outlaying different rooms and different challenges within. One of the most infamous was the Green Devil image, which you can occasionally find on Facebook or other images for a situation where the players are going to have a certain amount of trouble. So, if I was going to run the Tomb of Horrors, what I would do is I would scan those pictures. I would cut them out so I could give handouts to the players when they encountered those situations. And I would understand that using that as a visual aid is a really useful tool. Maps are both a blessing and a curse. When they come with a module, a lot of times there'll be a nice glossy map that you can lay out for your players. Some game masters choose to just lay them out, and then as the players go through different areas, they can put down monsters and creatures and whatnot. For some people that don't have miniatures and tokens and the like, they may choose just to use the maps that come with it only for the game master's eyes. In the case of this one, it's a small blue scale map on the inlet cover of the actual adventure itself. It's nothing to give to the players, because early adventurers oftentimes assumed that the group was going to have somebody dedicated to mapping out their dungeon as they explored it, based on the description of the rooms, based on the actions of the player characters themselves that helped them to get the information they needed to map out where they've been, so that in the in a situation of confusion, or if they're trying to eliminate places where secret doors might be, they can have a more structured approach to exploring the dungeon. It's a tried and true system that has somewhat gone by the wayside in modern day, as there are more and more ways of dressing up the dungeon with 3D dungeons and dungeon tiles and different things like that. A lot of times game masters will make the world come more real with physical or visual imagery to go along with the players, and you can't really do that when you're making the players use their mapping skills, or at least it's more difficult to. You have to jump through more hoops. With new players, I would probably make either some sort of layout maps so that I could put down segments of room as they encountered them, or I'd be tempted to do it with my 3D dungeoning tiles. I don't have enough for a whole dungeon, but I could certainly, cannibalize places they've been to outline new rooms. That dungeon is significant enough that I would probably go to those kind of extents to, give my players something really memorable. For a prepared dungeon, that's the kind of thing I'd be willing to do. If I was just doing this as an off-the-fly, I'd pull out my battle mat. That's always served me pretty well, and it doesn't mean that any secrets get revealed to the players before they're ready to see them. And I would just draw things out. So, my preparation, though, would be nearly identical. I would, while going through this, if I had no previous experience with this adventure, I would have, in the case this is Dungeons & Dragons, I would have my Dungeon Master's Guide out, and I would have my monster manual out so I could reference the monsters that are revealed in this module. Quick hint, there aren't very many. The Dungeon Master's Guide so that I could reference any kind of rules or anything that I needed to know. And I would probably also keep my player's handbook handy, noting the abilities of my players' characters, what they can do, what they would expect to be able to do, how they might short-circuit certain things, or how to be prepared to suggest that they use certain abilities, giving them hints and tricks and tips to kind of customize the adventure, but that's the next step. This particular adventure with the Tomb of Horrors would not be one that I would recommend for starters, but the preparation is pretty much the same. You should look over the adventure, you should learn the whys and the wherefores of the story, learn the storyline, beginning, middle, end, understand the motivations of the characters so that you can portray everything within effectively. And remember, too, if this is your first time, one important thing to bear in mind is don't panic. Your player should understand that you are taking on the responsibility to make sure they're having a good time. If they're fighting you and having a good time, then they're just describing themselves as the fools. If they're working against having fun, you deserve a certain amount of latitude. If you make a mistake, own up to it. Backtrack if you need to clear it up. If you make a mistake and somebody's character dies, you're the game master. You're effectively the god of your world. You can take back an unfortunate circumstance and say, okay, well, let's try it this way. And, and if all else fails, you can describe that, what you've done did not work. You want to try a different angle. Some players will go along with this. The best ones will. Generally, again, if it's all in the spirit of having fun with the game, especially if it's new to all of you and you've had a good experience up to that point, you can probably get away with botching and returning to a prior situation. Also, when you're doing a module for the first time, sometimes there will be holes and exploits that your players will come across. Don't sweat it. If they've come up with something particularly clever and it doesn't break the world, you can always talk with the players later and figure out a way to resolve it. If you come across something that you didn't understand, perhaps a rule that kind of got twisted a little bit, after the game you can always look back, find those details out, come back and say, I screwed this up. When we go on from here, we're going to do this the right way. Or maybe you'll adopt the way you did it and like it better and decide to keep it as a house rule. That's perfectly viable. As long as you're having fun, go for it. So, you've got your adventure read. You understand the characters. You are ready to be the director of this particular story. So, now you have to give some thought about the players, the people who are going to be in the story. And I always believe that it's best to do that after you've come to grips with the story that you want to tell. How are the players going to get involved? If you know the character of the individual players, and I'm not talking here about the characters on the paper, if you know what motivates a particular player, if they're somebody who really doesn't care about storyline, they just want a character that does cool things, hacks up monsters to itty-bitty bits, or casts cool spells, that's one particular type of character. And that player will probably play a character that satisfies those kind of needs or desires. Another one who's very driven by solving stories, solving puzzles, advancing storylines and feeling like they're accomplishing something, not necessarily by hacking their way through it, but by understanding the world and engaging with it. That's another kind of character. And that's another kind of player need that you may consider, how is this module going to address? And if you have players who love to absorb themselves into a character, they love the interplay of NPC and PC, or maybe of PC and PC, consider that kind of scenario. Now, looking at those players, and look at the characters that they're bringing to the table. If you have pre-generated characters, you already know some of the abilities that you're going to be looking at. You know, for instance, different things, motivations, what kind of things tie them into the storyline. Usually in a module, those kind of sample characters, at least in modern ones, will have some reason for being there in the story and will be given to the character. Maybe it'll be some notes that you'll be able to give them, or maybe it'll be simple things in the storyline saying, well, this person was spent some time at a monastery at this time in their training, and they know this about this character. The best ones will have little bits and pieces. And one that doesn't have anything like that, you can certainly twist the thing here and there to customize the module for your players. I highly recommend using this approach. If you're doing something like the introductory module, there's probably already going to be a great deal of that in there for you already. Your characters know the world. They know the universe they find themselves in, even if the players find this to be somewhat strange. So there will probably be segments in there where the player's character's knowledge comes to the fore and helps them to find their place in the world so that they can more fully roleplay and appreciate the story that you're telling them. In a story that isn't about the characters themselves, it's just a situation that they can walk into, or it's a circumstance that doesn't take the player's into account as much, except for, you know, what they can do in combat or what their effective skills may be. Something like this may not require as much tweaking because the players will bring whatever story they want to bring in into that situation, that adventure. You can have fun role-playing in a dungeon crawl type module. And honestly, sometimes some of the best role-playing you can get is when you're facing down seemingly insurmountable odds. You are in one of the more infamous dungeons in most of role-playing. You know, having a character who, you know, feels resigned to their fate and moans about it, or somebody who tries that much harder to be one of the blessed few who actually have succeeded, that can lead to some interesting role-playing situations. There aren't a lot of NPCs in the game, but the players can banter with each other, talk to each other, or not, depending on what the players themselves feel is within their comfort zone. So, little tweaks, little things can certainly seem to draw in the players a little bit easier into your world. Now, if I was going to run the Tomb of Horrors in my campaign world, I would have a few of the details in it tied in with some of the histories of the world that I'm running. I would probably change a few things so that they're more recognizable to the histories that I've drawn up, so that characters might get some hints, possibly, if they have a character with a high skill in history or what have you. That, of course, involves changing the edition. This is first edition Dungeons and Dragons, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I'm sorry, the early version. Bringing it up to 5th edition would, you know, behoove me to tie in a few mechanics that 5th edition uses that Advanced Dungeons and Dragons never did. Some people may see that as adding crutches to the game, but honestly, if I was doing this for early characters, this would be just a bloodbath. So, adding things like that may help players who expect a certain style of play because of the game that you're playing. Little tweaks like that are important. Even far more important than that is if you are converting a module from one game system to another. For right now, what I'm assuming is that you're running this as Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I showed you the books. For the Rogue Trader, you're using the rules that come with it. Later on, in another session of the dungeon, we'll discuss adapting modules from one edition or an entirely different game system to another. But, in the main, for the most part, they're still the same. They have a beginning, middle, and end. You need to know the flow and why things are the way they are. In the Rogue Trader, it's because you have a storyline. There's a crisis that the characters have to solve. Then they have to persevere against a variety of challenges that highlight the different features that role-playing game presents. The status of some characters over others, the ability to talk their way through situations or command others. The sheer combat focus of some other characters are going to give them their moments in the sun. It's all arranged so that the players get equal opportunities to do things. Tomb of Horrors, it's a lot about individual player cleverness, far more so than any combat abilities. So it's the players that are more tested in that than their ability to roleplay or play as characters. So, after we've gone through that, we've done some preparation, tooled the adventure to our characters, and understood how our characters are going to prepare. The next step is setting up your game space and getting ready for the game. Now, to do that, for the most part, if you have a game space, it should be someplace where there aren't a lot of distractions. Now, I have a 40-some inch TV off to one side. If we're playing, I will usually have something playing music through that without any kind of video display that would distract my players. I try to give my players comfortable chairs. The game table that we have is big enough to accommodate everybody so that we can all see each other, and that it's room for people to spread out with their essentials. I have a drop leaf in the middle so that I can have my game spread out, my adventure all prepared for the players so that we can get there and just get right into the game. Your game space may be something different. You may be all sitting on couches in your living room, writing off of clipboards or the backs of books. Be careful about losing dice in the cracks of the cushions. That's hurtful. You may be playing on a dining room table, or maybe in a pavilion in a park. Maybe you're playing in a rec center. What have you. You can play almost anywhere, but the couple things you should bear in mind. Number one, people play better when their needs are met. It should be reasonable temperature. It shouldn't be a lot of wind. It should be comfortable seating in enough places that you can roll dice or write. If you don't have all of the needs, you should have ways of overcoming those challenges. So the game space is, and of course, lighting is also important. Food and drink may be something you want to consider, especially if you're getting into a first session. It's often nice to have it. It was kind of like a little celebration of sorts. Think about food, think about drink, things like that. Gets people more in a mood to cooperate and work with you. Now, after you've got the space and you've welcomed your players into the group, it's really nice when I talked about the preparation, things like the player booklets, having those things in hand, handouts, having those all pre-ready, pre-printed. I'll give you some tricks about props down the road, but having things ready for your players so that when they come in, you are ready to go is the best way to go. If you're providing the dice, having those apportioned out so the players get there, they know that we're ready. You can spend a little time chit-chatting in the beginning, but at some point you have to draw things up and say, okay, let's get started. First of all, if there are any questions, it's a good idea to get them out of the way, especially if you're going to give a gentle reminder about a mechanic, like, say, the most common combat abilities. In Rogue Traders, it would be a good time to break out, how to use those dice and what a ballistic skill means or what a weapon skill means. Those are things that are most commonly going to be using if your first session is going to involve a lot of combat. If you were going to do the Dungeons & Dragons one, it's for more advanced characters, but if you're going to introduce somebody to the game using that, it would be a good time to show them what an armor class is, what their saving throws are, and what their gear may do. It may help them make up some decisions when they're in the dungeons. I wouldn't spend a lot of time on that. That's what session 0 is there for, but you have to remember you're in session 1 now. You're running the module, so make sure everybody has their focus to start out with as much as you can. You may want to have some music playing, something light and engaging. I may have said this before, but my recommendation, tabletop audio is a wonderful thing if you can have streaming music where you're at. They do great jobs with backgrounds and resources that can help bring your world to life. But don't play something that's constantly going to distract people. Some people love having, hard rock playing when there's combat involved. I find it to be a little distracting, especially if you have to talk over it. So, some things to consider. You'll find your own personal tastes as you start. So, everybody's looking eye to eye. First thing you might want to do is introduce the characters. Let everybody know that for this time, Jake is actually going to be, for this particular session, he is going to be stepping into the metal-clad boots of Nathan Sansos. And a quick description of what he may look like. Description of what the character looks like, I should say, not Jake. We know what Jake looks like, but what Nathan looks like, you will help to consolidate the player's expectations and their imagination on what the role that person is stepping into. If you have miniatures or figures by this time, it's a good time to break those out and introduce them, maybe put them in front of the character for the time being. And as you go around, let everybody possibly introduce their own character. Perhaps they'll do the introduction in character, which might be a great way of kickstarting off that particular role. Something that I highly recommend doing. Some people like to get into session by running a quick encounter where everybody is disparate, and then, okay, well, this person walks in and you describe their character, and then they all react off of each other's characters. However you want to do it, just as long as you have some means that everybody can kind of understand who the other characters are, so that they can begin to understand how they're going to interplay with each other. And then you go to the beginning of the module, the player's introduction, and if you haven't paraphrased it, prepared to narrate. Break into your narrator's voice. After everybody is focusing on you and you have their attention, begin the adventure. You know, you will oftentimes, if you have not done this before, you may feel a little uncomfortable. That's perfectly understandable. You're stepping foot into a new world, and you're not sure how you're going to do at this point. But I'll tell you this much. If you have a good group, they're just looking to be entertained. They don't have, perhaps, the expectations that you might be afraid that they'd have. And if they do and things turn out badly, again, you're playing a game. This can all be taken away. You can start over. There's nothing that's going to be long-lasting about this unless it comes out to be something good. And if it turns out into a giant flaming wreck, you'll still have a memory to talk about with your friends. So, you start your narration. You read it through. The players may have some questions, or they may start role-playing, or maybe they'll even think about jumping into that world and starting to wonder what they can do. For the Tomb of Horrors, it starts out expecting the players to be self-motivating. You don't even know where the dungeon is to start out with if you read it right from the beginning. They have to find the dungeon first. If you are looking at the rogue trader, it throws them right into an explosive situation where they have to immediately start acting. They're told what they have to do. There's forces that are at play that are driving them onward, and they are going to be swept up along with it, or things will probably turn out fairly badly. So the players will learn that they have to be acted upon in some ways, but things will often turn out better if they can be the ones who are the acting force. Different games have different feels. Sometimes they'll be passive in a sandbox environment. The players dictate the actions. Sometimes they'll be very linear, where everything will be driven for the characters. Those introductory adventures are usually fairly linear. Dungeons are kind of an open sandboxy thing. The players can pick their own paths, although sometimes that's a false illusion of freedom. So, however you run it, that will be determined by the adventure and your particular taste and the taste of your players. So, you've gotten to this point. You survived. You've begun to tell your story. Now all you have to do is run the rules as you understand them, set up things for your players to take their first steps, and as far as all of your prep work, everything that's been leading to this moment, you've arrived. The stage is yours. You are now a game master. There's no doubt about it. Where we go from there on will be the subject of the next session. Actually running the game. So, very well done. I think you've definitely earned some treasure for this one. Look what we found. A simple box, perhaps? Perhaps you couldn't see it. It's adorned with symbols of luck, leprechauns, grinning fae, gods of chance. I wonder what could be inside, eh? I think perhaps we should open it up and take a look. Well, there's nothing in here but a set of playing cards. Just a simple deck, nothing more. Correct? If you've been gaming at any length of time playing Dungeons and Dragons, you might have recognized that description as a minor artifact known as a deck of many things. Something of an infamous magical item that has both brought prosperity as well as bedevilment to any number of groups. The deck of many things is a small amount of cards that are immune to any magical interference or divination. And anybody who gets a hold of one may declare that they are drawing a certain number of cards, upon which time they take the topmost card and they reveal it. Not good. Flames. Nasty card. It means I have a new enemy somewhere in the world. They will try to undo me, unless I can undo them first. Not something taken lightly. Unfortunately, before I picked these up, I declared 5 cards, so... The Comet. A good sign. You know what? I think I'll pick the rest of them in just a little while. Now, why am I showing you this, eh? Well, this highlights another opportunity that a game master has to enhance the game for his fellows a little bit. Now, this particular deck that I have, I purchased. And the cards are nice and big and legible. They have wonderful art on them and things like that. If I ever use a deck of many things, which I do but rarely, because of the havoc they can cause to a group, it's nice to have the gravitas enhanced by giving the players something that they can hold, something they can touch and feel. It is no small thing in game to draw a deck of many things, things that can destroy you utterly with just a flip of a card, or can bring you incredible wealth, power, a new magical item, a faithful friend, many different possibilities. Now, the people who created early role-playing games were very, very fond of random tables. If you play Dungeons & Dragons, another magical item that is fairly infamous is called the Wand of Wonder. Every time you point it at somebody and use it, you roll a percentile and see what happens. It's out of your hands. You roll well enough, perhaps you fire out a mighty fireball that obliterates some of your foes. Or maybe a stream of butterflies flies out. Or maybe you shrink. You don't know. I've seen lots of alternate tables for Wands of Wonder as well, and I've made one myself to add to the insanity, to break up the monotony of only having 100 different things that could happen. I've seen a table of 1,000 different things that can happen from a Wand of Wonder, ranging from kind of squicky to really impressively powerful. And those capture the imagination quite well. However, when it comes to randomness, resolving it with a simple dice roll is one thing, especially if it's something that you're going to be using again and again and again. A person can very easily just keep using that Wand of Wonder, especially in an edition where it got turned into a Rod of Wonder, so it had unlimited uses. But the Wand of Wonder sometimes worked out in your favor, sometimes it didn't, sometimes it was useless. You took your chances. With something random and powerful like the deck, treating it with a little bit more care, giving the player something they can feel, something they can hold, something that can ratchet up the dread as they reach out, and yet the hope that something truly amazing will come of it, is something that, you don't want to deprive the players of that kind of an experience. So having something physically on hand for those kind of circumstances can be much more powerful than a simple die roll. This particular deck I got, this was created in the golden days of the 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, which opened up a lot of third parties coming in and making games. This one was made by Green Ronin Publishing a while ago, and it was $10. And now I have, if I ever decide to use that, a very useful, very pretty way of showing characters what their fates are, and the players to both thrill in granting new power or the despair of something horrible happening to their characters. I will say that in the case of the decks of many things, there was a lot less trepidation about using them in earlier games when stories weren't as developed around the characters. Death was accepted with a certain amount of fatalism, if that's the correct word for it. So that's something that I have become increasingly reluctant to offer to players, simply because a valued character that has a central part in my story could be taken away, just a draw. And if it doesn't have that kind of sting, then the truly incredible rewards that are available, they lose their power. I mean, they just become a gift, a handout. That possibility of something bad happening has to be there side by side. Otherwise, it doesn't work as an item. So, if your game involves some kind of what's-its, maybe it's a magical box of some sort, maybe it's a small trinket that has special abilities, maybe it's just a key. A little bit of time, perhaps you make something that the players can hold on to and actually cement that into their imaginations. So that's my bit of treasure. Well done, you've made it to the end of level 12. Congratulations. You get 15 layer points tonight. And tell you what, I'll give you a draw on my new deck of many things here. That is if one of the next 3 cards isn't particularly nasty for me. So, thank you for coming. I hope this entertained you, and I hope it gave you some ideas for when you run your own adventures. Thank you, and have a safe journey.